Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio General Class, session number 2. During our previous session, which was the orientation, we had a look at the logistics, a bit about the course itself. We introduced the facilitator for the program. We had a discussion on the React organization. We introduced Zello. Then we talked briefly about what amateur radio is all about. We got into the various classes of amateur radio licenses. We then talked about the learning objectives of the course. We gave an outline of what to expect with the sessions for the course. Then we had a look at the course material that we'll be distributing to all of the participants, as well as the optional material, inclusive of the text that is going to be used by the instructor. We also had a look at the amateur radio examinations to become a licensed ham. And of course, we had a brief look at the licensing process, both for the US and Trinidad and Tobago. Then we dealt with a couple of frequently asked questions, as well as a quick look at what ham radio equipment might look like, different types. Then we had a quick look at the question pool, and we also discussed the next steps for the classes. So just to mention again, if it is participants in the general class course, which is really or essentially level 2, have not yet taken the technician class course, which is the previous level or the level 1, on your screen are the links to be able to take the on-demand version of the technician class course. So all of the documents are available at that link on your screen, tdocs.ttreact.com, and the playlist with all of the 16 sessions for the technician class course is at tvids.ttreact.com. So don't worry too much if you have not had a look at that material as yet. Session number 2 today, we'll begin some of the theory and we will ramp up as we go. So you do have some time, all of this week here as well, to begin looking at some of the technician class sessions if you have not yet done so. And it's a good idea as well for even persons who have done so and even become licensed to have a relook as a refresher. In terms of today's agenda, well, we don't have any questions outstanding from the last session rather. We'll just put up the chart to show the curriculum progress and then deal with the links to the practice exams. We'll again just put up the slide on Zello. Persons have been inquiring about that. And again, the course material so that everyone will be focused in on what they need to have or not necessarily have. And then we get into the technical material beginning today. So because this is the bridge between the technician class and what we're doing now, about to embark on the general class material, we'll do a brief review of some of the basic concepts that we dealt with in the technician class: electricity, voltage, current, direct current, alternating current, resistance, and of course the water analogy that we have been using. So that should help persons who have not yet gone into the technician class material. It should be a good start for you and a refresher for the rest of us. And then the concepts of reactance, impedance, then admittance, and resonance. After that, once we have dealt with the theory associated with those concepts or those topics, we will then go at the question pool, have a look at the questions that are related to the theory that we would have done this evening. And then we will set the date for the next session. Okay, so as mentioned, there are no outstanding questions from the session number 1. This slide, which shows the syllabus that we'll be following, the yellow arrow here will show just where we are, and you'll see this yellow arrow go down as we progress from session to session. So just to give us an idea where we are, so we don't lose sight of what we're about. So today we are dealing with electrical principles. So I've just begun. It's a good idea to begin taking practice exams as soon as you wish, as soon as you're comfortable. You can start all now, even though you may not have gone into the material just yet. As we would have mentioned previously, you have prior knowledge and you may be quite surprised just how much you know when you take the practice exams. This will also give you a gauge for when you're ready for the real test. Again, the practice tests are based on the same question pool that your real exam will be based on. So in a sense, the practice exam is an exam, right? Just that you would be credited for it. So have a look at them. These question sites sometimes come and go. So we listed quite a few on your screen. And we will be every session reminding students about the practice exams. It is the way to know if you're ready and when you're ready to take the exams. I don't think there's a better gauge than this. Again, because a couple of persons have inquired about Zello after session number 1, we're just putting the slide back up. It will be in your slide deck that you get a copy of. So again, the channel that we use is called React Members. It's really to install the app, whether it's on the iPhone, Android, or PC. And once it's installed, you create an account for yourself. And afterwards, you join the channels of your choosing. You can create your own channels. But the one that we use for the networks, as mentioned, on a Saturday evening and also a Monday evening at 9 p.m. both days, is React Members with a space. You can also join the React Members channel without the space. That's a backup channel. Right, so that's it for Zello. Okay, so just a reminder in terms of the course material. So we have distributed the entire question pool that contains all 430 odd questions that you can possibly get in the exams. Of course, you'll only get 35 questions out of that 430. We have also distributed part 97. It's not necessary that you read it, but we highly encourage persons to at least become familiar with it, especially as the regulation-based questions are related to parts of this part 97 regulation document from the US. And an alternative text that's made freely available to all of the participants would be this on your screen here. It's the Amateur Radio General Class License Class Syllabus by Jack Tiley, and another good perspective if you need to. So it's not necessary that you read it through, but we encourage you to have a look at it as well. It's always good sometimes to get information from different perspectives. And most importantly on this slide, the link here, gdocs.ttreact.com, that will be where you will get all of your documents for this particular course. So we will avoid emailing the larger documents such as the slide deck to fill up people's mailboxes. And we'll just simply place it into this cloud storage folder and you can access it. These will be uploaded usually within 24 hours of the course. So you can have a look at it at any time that's convenient to you. All of the material that we have distributed so far is at this link, gdocs.ttreact.com. Also, all of the recorded sessions, and hopefully we'll be able to record all of the sessions. Hopefully the sessions will stick. We'll be placing the link. All of the vids will be here, gvids.ttreact.com, so that you can look over any of the material. If you missed a session for whatever reason, all of it will be here for you to be able to review at your convenience. In terms of optional material, just a reminder, on your screen, we have the text that we can recommend if you wish to purchase. It's not necessary, it's optional for you. However, one of them, the one that's in the yellow box here, is the one that the instructor will be using to take you through the course material. It's in fact the question pool with some guidance information inside of there. Very convenient format that this author has. So we will be using this. It's not necessary that you purchase the text, but we recommend that you consider purchasing it. It will support the author and it will be good reference material for you to have, especially those of us who may like to have have an advanced view of before the class themselves. Also, sometimes people may prefer to have a printed version. So we have the Amazon website as well as the author's website that you can purchase the PDF copy, or you can purchase the actual text itself. Up to you, not necessary, highly recommended. Right, so let's get into the technical topics by reviewing some of the material from the technician class that will remind us as we go into the general class material. This will be a good launchpad. And we are under electrical principles. So the question really is, what is electricity? As we discussed in the technician class, we remind ourselves that electricity is the flow of something. It's the flow of something that's called electrons. And electrons will flow in a circuit. So on your screen, we have schematic diagrams. You have a battery connected to some sort of a load or resistor, and then a wire that connects the circuit. This is a schematic showing components and an electrical diagram that electrons will flow. The battery will generate that flow of electrons. Similarly, if you have AC line power in your house, your home, whether it's 120 volts AC, you can also have a load of some sort. It could be a lamp, it could be something else, it could be a blender, it could be a refrigerator, some load. You have alternating current, and alternating current, of course, goes in both directions. It alternates, hence the name alternating current. So we have two schematic diagrams here that shows that the electricity flows. But what actually flows are particles called electrons. And we have said that electrons operate in an electric circuit, just like a water circuit will, and we'll come to the water analogy in a little bit. So the electrons flow in the wires in the same way that water will flow in a pipe or in the your household plumbing. And in the same way, the plumbing needs pathways. That's your, maybe it's the PVC piping or the hot water piping, however, whatever you have at your home. Similarly, in electric circuits, you need a wire, you need a conductor for the electrons to flow. So see this one here, a DC circuit. This one is an alternating current circuit, but it's complete, it's closed loop, and the current will flow. And that current will, let's say, power a device. Again, whether it's your refrigerator or a lamp or bulb or something like that. Right? So two examples of schematics. Voltage and current are two terms that we need to be very familiar with as amateur radio operators. They are key parameters. And voltage is the term to describe the force that causes those electrons to flow. So if you have a battery here, and we would have given an analogy, the battery is like a pump. It will try to pump out electrons, right? So there's the conventional current that goes from positive to negative. That's conventional current, right? That's the direction that we're talking about. Of course, some of those with advanced knowledge may say, but wait a minute, the electrons themselves flow from negative to positive. And those from, with even further advanced knowledge will say, well, you know, there's not actually any flow at all, right? But for our purposes, we are talking about the flow of electrons through a circuit, and it's taking this direction, conventional current. And current, the voltage is what applies that pressure, that force for the electrons to flow. So voltage, sometimes referred to as the letter E for electromotive force, and sometimes it's referred to as V because it's voltage, V for voltage, right? And the unit of force is called the volt. Right, so when electrons flow, so while the voltage is the force that pushes or pressurizes the circuit so that the electrons will flow, that actual flow is measured in a term called amperes. So that's called the current. The current flows, and amperes will be the unit of measurement, and the symbol is the letter I. So you'll see I here for the current, and it's in amperes. So you have the symbol. And we will just quickly introduce the resistor as well. So a resistor resists, as the name says, the flow of those electrons in a circuit, and the unit is called the ohm. Right? So there's a resistor, and that could stand for anything that's resisting, such as a load. If you put a bulb in the circuit there, that's a load. It will resist the flow. It will light up, yes, but it becomes resistance in this direct current circuit. So we have been talking about direct current where the current flows in one direction. We also mentioned earlier that there's alternating current, such as your house supply, your receptacle outlet in your home. That plug, as sometimes we call it, it's really called a receptacle outlet. You put you plug into it and you get power. Well, the power that comes from your home is usually 120 volt DC, depending on where you live in the world. Some it's 240 volts DC, AC, sorry. So 120 volts AC, 240 volts AC, or some other value, but it's usually alternating current that's coming into your house that you will plug into. And you see that the current will flow in one direction and then quickly reverse in another direction, right? Because the frequency at which that happens, or the number of times in a second, is called the frequency, and the unit is called the hertz. So that alternating of the current in one direction to the other, how many times that switches in 1 second, frequency, right? The unit is called the hertz. So all of these things are on your screen. So we're just recapping some of these things. All of these were detailed, spent quite a bit of time in the technician class, but this is just bridging between the technician and the general, because we'll be coming to some terms where we'll be talking about voltage and current and resistance. So we should just go through what they are, as well as direct current and alternating current. So it's good to compare and contrast the difference between direct current and alternating current. We'll see that the voltage is one value, or at least it's positive, one value in direct current. Alternating current, we notice that it's switching between positive values and negative values in a sinusoidal fashion, right? So a sine wave, as we'll call it. So it's alternating. Again, this is one cycle, and the number of cycles in a second is called the frequency. So you have direct current, and there's a schematic diagram as shown before. We're matching it, direct current. This is the graph of current over time. And here, for the alternating current, is also a graph of current, well, voltage over time rather, and it shows that it alternates between positive and negative. And we'll see the diagram here, rather the schematic diagram that shows an alternating current circuit. And the last term that we need to be familiar with, mentioned it a little bit earlier, it's resistance, and it does exactly that. It puts up a resistance to what? The flow of current in a circuit. So if you have a circuit here on your screen, schematic diagram, you have the battery, it's trying to push electrons through it, and it comes up this resistance that slows it down. It pushes back against it, but it will still flow. Some of it will anyway, and it continues onwards. But this here is example or symbol for a resistor that sort of pushes back or restricts the flow of that current. It's called a resistor. And the unit is the ohm. And this is the symbol here, omega, for ohms, right? And thing about resistance is that it will resist flow of any kind, whether it's direct current or alternating current, right? So here we have a direct current schematic diagram that shows the battery pushing the electrons around the circuit, and the resistor is resisting. Here we have our trusty alternating current schematic diagram, alternating current source, wires that connected through a load of some sort and back to the source. Of course, the current goes in one direction, flips and goes in the other, flips and goes in the other, and so on. It does that several times a second. It does that 60 times a second in Trinidad and Tobago, 60 hertz. And this resistor that's in the circuit will also resist. It will resist it when it's going in this direction. It will also resist when it's going in this direction. So that's what we mean by the resistor will resist no matter whether it's direct current or alternating current. So that's resistance. And we have an exploded view of the, well, it's a nice mnemonic. It shows here what happens where you have voltage that is trying to push the electrons through the circuit, and it's trying to push the current through. But you have the resistance here in ohms that is squeezing, it's restricting, it's resisting, so that the current is having a hard time. But the voltage is trying its best to push the current through the circuit, right? So remember, what flows are electrons, right? So you have current flow, you have voltage that's pushing, that's the pump, and you have a good old ohm here that is squeezing on this rope and making it tighter and difficult, resisting. So hopefully all of this helps us visualize the concept. One last diagram, one last slide before we get into some new material. That is the water circuit analogy we've been using during the technician class. So of course, on the left-hand side here, this is a water circuit. It shows a pump, and you have pipes, and you have taps, and smaller pipes or smaller tubes, or, you know, It's a water circuit compared to the electric circuit on your right-hand side, the schematic diagram, where we have similar types of components. So whereas in a water circuit, you have a pump, whether you have a pump at your house or maybe the water authority is sending water to you, they have a pump. So there's some pump that is pushing water to you through the pipes. And of course, you'll have a tap, a valve that you'll open and close, right? Whether it's a shower or whether it's a face basin or whether it's a kitchen sink or a yard tap, right? And it flows. And sometimes you have, these pipes here. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller. So that's what this water circuit represents. And on the right-hand side, electricity operates very similarly. And that's why we're using the analogy, because sometimes we understand water quite well. We use it every day. We talk about flow. We talk about current. In the beach, you'll see, say, the current is strong. We talk about it all every day. We go, and we use those terms and familiar with water. But when it comes to electricity, we may think we don't know it, but you already do. You know it. So it's just to apply it. And that's why we do use the analogy, electric circuit. Equivalent of the pump in the water circuit is the battery. The battery is pushing, it's pumping the electrons through. Of course, just say you have a smaller pipe here, it's a constriction. Same thing, you have a resistor. It's a constriction for the flow of the electrons as the current tries to flow. And of course, you have a switch that turns on and off. If it's open, then nothing flows. If it's closed, then it starts to flow. What's flowing is the electrons. In the water circuit, what's flowing? Water. So you have a switch here that's on and off. In your water circuit, it's a valve that shuts off. Of course, usually it's variable as well. You can also have variable resistors in an electric circuit. But hopefully, this gives an idea of the analogy that we're using to help us understand and realize that we are already familiar with the concepts when it comes to water. We just need to apply to electricity to gain an understanding. So we'll do a couple more slides before we take our break. We'll begin some of the new material, and you'll quickly see why it was necessary that we familiarize ourselves with the previous information that we saw earlier, right? So let's have a go at it. So we did say that we'll be talking about the concept of reactance. What is reactance? So just a little quip there, has nothing to do with the organization REACT. Reactance, similar to resistance, is the opposition to the flow of current. But what type of current? Alternating current, or AC. So if we were to look at the schematic diagram below here, this diagram is attempting to say that in a diagrammatic fashion. So we have alternating current. Notice it's not a direct current. Direct current is different, right? Alternating current flow goes in one direction, the other direction, it alternates, right? And if you notice too, we have two components inside of here. You may have remembered from the technician class that we talked about a coil being called an inductor, symbol L, and a capacitor, C for capacitor, right? And we learned that these things can store charges. One will do so in an electric field and one will do so in a magnetic field. You may remember that. And these components in the circuit here, if they are inductors and capacitors, when the alternating current flows through, because we have these components here, we refer to the opposition that these components cause as reactance. We don't say resistance. So just for comparing and contrasting, we have a DC, well, it's an AC circuit here, but we show a resistor. So we're not talking about a resistor that's resisting the flow here. We're talking about a coil or inductor or capacitor that is in the circuit, and that is causing some resistance in a way, but we don't call it that. We call it reactance because it's alternating current, and capacitance is causing the slowdown or the pushback, and inductance is causing the slowdown or the pushback in that alternating circuit. Notice we have not put into the schematic diagram any resistors. This is a resistor here, but we don't have any. So even though we don't have any resistors in there, there's still that restriction in the flow of the electrons because of these components, the inductor, which is a coil, and the capacitor. And we call that pushback or that constriction or that reduction in the flow or that resistance, we call it reactance. We do not say resistance. It's alternating current, the effect of capacitance and inductance in the flow of electrons, and that pushback or that restriction or that slowdown of the flow is called reactance. So hopefully we have just defined what reactance is. And as we would have done in the technician class, but the majority of the time you see slides with text in yellow, that is an exam question. So there's an exam question as to what reactance is. So it's the opposition to the flow of alternating current by capacitors and inductors, or capacitance and inductance. And that's an exam question. So, right, remember we said we're doing light touch theory, hopefully sufficient to gain an understanding, but we are exam focused. So we'll be highlighting the exam questions, and we have supporting information around it to help us hopefully understand. So again, capacitors and inductors in the water circuit, we use the analogy of the pressure tank. Remember that pressure tank? You have the pump. You don't want the pump turning on every second, on and off. You have the pump, it will run for a little bit, it will pressurize the pressure tank, and that will hold water. In the same way that an inductor will store charge, it will store it via magnetic field. Capacitors does the same thing. It stores a charge, but it stores it as an electric field. Similarly, and that's why we use the analogy of a pressure tank, if you're familiar with that, in a plumbing circuit or water circuit. So for reactance, you may remember for resistance, it's the ohm, right? We sometimes use the letter R to represent. But the letter that we use, or the symbol that we use for reactance, is X, right? So X marks the spot. So just that's an exam question, so you need to learn it, you need to remember it. For reactance, which is the kind of resistance, don't say I said it, but it's the resistance that occurs in an alternating current circuit with capacitors and inductors. That quote-unquote resistance is called reactance. So if you're familiar with resistance, reactance is that for alternating current circuits where you have capacitors and inductors. Symbol is X. So similarly, just like resistance, we use ohms to measure resistance. We also use the ohm to measure reactance, right? Again, it's because it's a pushback. It's pushing back, or a constriction, or it's trying to stop the flow, right? It's trying to make that flow difficult. So it's called the ohm is the unit of reactance. So hopefully that's straightforward enough, right? So up on your screen, like many things, there are various formulas or formulae. Not that we necessarily have to learn all that you're seeing on your screen here, but we provide extra information to gain an understanding. So the last bullet point is actually the exam question, but we're going to work out eventually how we get to this bullet point for the exam. So we don't want to just learn by rote to say, okay, if there's an inductor in a circuit, if you increase the frequency of the alternating current, then the reactance increase. We don't want to just remember that. We will want to show why that is so, or what causes us to know that is so. And what causes us to know that is so starts off with the reactance formula. So we say if you have a purely inductive circuit, right? And purely inductive simply means that the only component other than the source is an inductor. So when you say purely inductive, it means it just has an inductor in the circuit. There's no capacitor per se in the circuit, or there's no resistor in the circuit, or other types of components. It's only an inductor. So don't get too tied up. We're introducing it to the technical terms. This is what they say in a purely inductive circuit. Don't worry about purely inductive. It just simply means all you have is an inductor or a coil in the circuit. That's the fancy language for that, right? But there's this formula. Remember we said reactance is X. Now you may recall that L is an inductor, right? If you have a coil that has inductance, the symbol is L. So XL, and this L is actually a subscript L. So it's down off to the right, right? So XL, X subscript L, reactance is equal to 2 multiplied by pi multiplied by F, which is frequency, multiplied by L, which is the inductance. So if you want to find out the reactance of the circuit or something, you have to use this formula. Now we are only going to use this formula to show that when you increase frequency, reactance also increases. That's all we are showing. That's why we're using this formula here. And it stands to reason. If you increase a term on this side, of course, the left-hand side would also increase. That's how the mathematics work, right? But we'll show an example to prove that that is so. So XL is the inductive reactance. How we know inductive reactance? Well, X is in fact reactance, and L is inductance or an inductor, right? So XL, inductive reactance, which is measured in ohms. Pi is a number 3.142 approximately, right? It's a constant. That is the symbol pi. So that's in the formula. And F represents frequency in hertz, and L would represent inductance in henries. So anytime you see a formula like this, XL is equal to 2 pi FL, it means XL, which is this what you're trying to work out, reactance, is equal to 2 multiplied by pi, multiplied by frequency, multiplied by L for inductance. So we don't have the multiplication in there. We could have easily put a dot, or we could have put a multiplication sign. However, it's understood that when we have a formula like this, these terms are multiplied by each other. 2 multiplied by pi, multiplied by F, multiplied by L. So this is the exam question here. It will ask you, and in an inductor, or an inductor reacts to alternating current. So notice this is alternating current source. You have an inductor. How will it react if you increase the frequency of this source? Well, as the frequency of the applied AC increases, that's this frequency here, the reactance increases. Again, we will show a worked out formula. But once you should realize that once you increase the terms on this side here, then this should also increase because this is equal to this, right? So let's go into an example. Again, this is not necessary for the exam. This is just to help us aid an understanding on how you work it out. Or do you just want to take it for granted that when the frequency increases, the inductance increases? Yeah. So, sorry, the reactance increases. All right. So let's look at it. We're using the same formula that we just shared. XL, that's inductive reactance, is equal to 2 multiplied by pi multiplied by the frequency multiplied by the inductance. So the question is, what happens to reactance when you increase frequency from 1 to 2? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use simple numbers. We're not going to use very large numbers or anything with a lot of decimal places and all that, right? So we're just going, the frequency is 1 hertz and we're increasing it to 2 hertz. What happens to reactance? Does it go up or does it go down? That's all we are trying to do here to prove this previous bullet point that we are taking as a given. But we want to make sure, is that really true? The statement that as you increase the frequency of the AC, it will increase the reactance. All right, so let's look. So this is the formula, and we're going to substitute, well, 2 is a constant. Pi, well, we know what pi is 3.142 approximately. And we are going to go from frequency 1 to frequency equal to 2. So we're going to have 2 calculations. So in the first calculation, we say if pi is equal to 3, frequency is equal to 1, and L is equal to 2. And we're just using pi is equal to 3 to make it easy to calculate, right? So if we were to multiply that, we will get 12. If it is, and how we get 12? 2 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 1 multiplied by 2. That's how we get 12. So we have 2 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 1 multiplied by 2. This is what we're substituting here. So hopefully we can follow that. And we will get, when we multiply, we'll get 12. So that's fine. So that's when frequency is equal to 1. So we're only going to change frequency now in the next step formula, right? We are changing frequency from frequency equal to 1 hertz to 2 hertz. That's all we are changing. The constant 2 remains the same. Pi remains the same at approximately 3. And the inductance L equals to 2, right? That's going to stay the same. So the only thing we are changing here, and we've highlighted it for you, this is the only change. We are going from frequency equal 1 to frequency equal to 2. What happens to the reactance? Does it increase or does it decrease? So we notice that 2 multiplied by 3 is 6. 6 multiplied by 2 is 12. And 2 multiplied by 2, 24. Sorry, 2 multiplied by 3 is 6. 6 multiplied by 2 is 12. And 12 multiplied by 2 is 24, right? So we will see that when we move from the frequency equal 1 hertz to frequency equal to 2 hertz, we will see that the inductance, again, the reactance moves from 12 to 24. So we can see when we increase frequency, we have increased the reactance as well. And that is what this exam question is asking. So as the frequency increases, the reactance also increases. And we have repeated that bullet point on the same slide. As the frequency of the alternating current increases, so too does the reactance of the inductor, right? So increase frequency, your reactance increases. That's it. So let's take a 2-minute break, and then we'll come back and do the rest of our slides. So 2-minute break, get up, maybe have a little stretch, a little bathroom break, have some water, and we'll be back in 2 minutes time. Okay, right. So let's tackle a couple of the questions that I'm seeing that have been asked. So Adesh, yeah, good evening. All right. Yeah, take it that you're getting the audio now. Arthur, right. So the question pool has 430 questions in it, of which you'll get 35 in the exam to do. So you have to answer those 35 questions. There's no time limit per se. However, most persons will do an exam in under 1 hour. Some people will take half an hour, some people even less, right? So usually less than an hour will be sufficient time, but there's no pressure time-wise per se. I mean, we don't think anyone will take 2 and 3 hours to do any one of the exams, of course, but no pressure in that sense. You take your time and do it as well as you can. But having said that, you probably don't need more than an hour to do the exam, right? So I hope that answers the question there, Arthur. All right. So let's pick up where we left off. All right. So we talked about inductive reactance, a purely inductive circuit. So let's do the capacitive side where you have a capacitor. So again, there's a little typo, or rather a line moved on the slide. So we'll have to correct it for your slide deck. However, this formula here is the formula for capacitive reactance, right? So before we had the formula for inductive reactance, right, where you have an inductor alone in the circuit, and we are calculating reactance. So again, these formulas do not need to be learned right now for your exams, but we are using it to show how they got the last bullet point that's stated on your screen. That's also an exam question, right? So we're just trying to explain how did they get to this statement? How do they know that when you in a capacitive circuit or purely capacitive circuit, remember, so purely capacitive, that means that apart from the source, the alternating current source, the only other component is a capacitor. That's what they mean by purely capacitive. Only a capacitor. Here's our capacitor, right? But they're saying here, and it's an exam question, that as the frequency of the alternating current increases, the reactance of the circuit will decrease. How do they know that, right? So we're just showing the formula here. So if you were to just take this line and put it in between the 1 and the 2 pi fc, right? So this line should actually be about here or so, right? We'll correct it for the slide deck. So this is the capacitive reactance formula, and you will notice a pattern. It looks kind of similar, except it has 1 over, and instead of L, it has a C, right? So a very similar formula. We won't go into a lot of detail about the formula, other than to say that we will use this to prove this point. But this is an exam question, that as a capacitor reacts to alternating current, the way it does so is as the frequency increases of the applied AC, the reactance decreases. So it's an inverse relationship. And that shouldn't be surprising, because 1 over something is an inverse relationship. It's a reciprocal, right? So if you increase frequency here, you're actually dividing it into 1. So therefore, the term on this side is expected to decrease. As you increase the denominator here, you expect this value here to decrease. So increasing this frequency here, we have a decreased reactance. So let's show that with a similar calculation that we did for the case of the inductor. So again, we're staying with the capacitive or purely capacitive circuit, and we're dealing with reactance. You have the AC source, and all you have in the circuit is a capacitor. There's no resistor, there's no inductor, there's nothing else, just the hookup wires, okay? Right, so the formula is better. It looks better here. It's 1 over 2 pi fc. So capacitive reactance, XC, is equal to 1, that's the numerator, divided by 2 multiplied by pi. And remember, pi is approximately 3.142. We will be saying pi is equal to 3 for our purpose, right? We have that creative license. And F is frequency, and C is the value of the capacitor, right, in farads. So the question is, what happens to reactance when you increase frequency from 1 to 2? So again, we're increasing the frequency, but we want to see what happens to the reactance. Does it increase or does it decrease? As simple as that. So here we have the 2 lines. It says if frequency is equal to 1, so 2 is a constant, pi is equal to 3, and C is equal to 2. Then when we do this calculation here, we get reactance, capacitive reactance, XC is equal to 0.08. But what happens if we change F, frequency, from 1? Instead of using 1 in the formula, we change that value to 2. We're plugging in 2 instead of 1. What happens to XC equal to? What is it? So we plug F is equal to 2 in. When we do the calculation, we get XC is equal to 1 over 24, which is 0.04, which is a decrease. So that's how we conclude. When we increase frequency, we go from 1 to 2, we decrease the capacitive reactance, because it goes from 0.08 to 0.04, half. So that's how we get, as the frequency of the AC increases, the capacitive reactance decreases. If I were to go back to the previous slide, that's the exam question. A capacitor reacts to AC in such a way as the frequency of the applied AC increases, the reactance decreases. So you'll notice in the case of the inductor, as the frequency increases, the reactance increases, right? In the case of the capacitor, as the frequency increases, the reactance decreases. So an inverse relationship, right? And we need to know those for the exam, but hopefully we're showing you how they come up with that conclusion, right? So you could see it from the formula by itself. That is how we can tell if we need to work it out, right? Okay, there's the comparison there for you. On top, purely inductive circuit. The bottom, purely capacitive circuit. an inductor alone, a capacitor alone in the circuit. And this is the formula to work out the inductive reactance, which is equal to 2 pi FL, and capacitive reactance, XC, is equal to 1 divided by 2 pi FC, 2 multiplied by pi multiplied by F multiplied by C. So inductive and capacitive. As frequency increases, reactance will increase. In this case here, as frequency increases, because it's on the denominator, reactance will decrease. Yeah. All right, so hopefully that's helpful. Couple more concepts to go. Impedance. So you'll say, but wait a minute, we talked about resistance, and we say that, all right, that you have direct current, it pushes back, even alternating current, it pushes back, you have resistance, right? Then we talked about reactance, which is also a restriction or pushback against the flow. But then we're talking about another term, impedance. What is impedance? Impedance is simply a combination of resistance and reactance. So both resistance and reactance oppose the flow of current. But notice I didn't say an addition. I didn't say it's a summation, because impedance is a little more complex than that. You can't just add resistance to reactance. So in this circuit here, notice it's not purely inductive, it's not purely capacitive, and it's not purely resistive. It actually is an LCR circuit. It has an inductor, it has a resistor. And by the way, this is the other symbol for resistor. You can have it as a jagged zigzag line, or you can have it as this, right? Resistor, capacitor. So this has all three of those components, right? You cannot just add up the reactance to the resistance and get the impedance, right? It's a little more complex than that, right? But for our purposes, it's a combination. Resistance, which we learned about, and we just learned about reactance. So when you combine them, you get impedance. So impedance encompasses both of them, right? Impedance, because reactance is measured in ohms and resistance is also measured in ohms. Impedance, because it's a combination of resistance and reactance, is also measured in ohms. Yeah, should come as no surprise. And the symbol for impedance is the letter Z. Some people will say Z. All right, and here's the exam question. They ask, what is impedance? Now, impedance is the ratio of voltage to current, right? That's the version of the definition that they will want from you, right? But we've just given you how you get it or what it is about. But there's another one of the ways or formula that you could consider. On the right-hand side, those of you who took the technician class may be familiar with Amau's plate, where we show the Ohm's law and how easy it is to derive any term once you know E is equal to IR. You can get I is equal to E over R, or R is equal to E over I. Similarly, if we replace R with Z, we'll get Z is equal to E over I if we were to replace R with Z, because Z is impedance, right? So impedance, remember, is resistance and reactance. In this formula here, Ohm's law, we only had resistance, right? So we are similar construct. Impedance is the ratio of voltage to current. And that's what you need to know for the exam. Right. Yet another term, admittance. What is that? Well, you could kind of say it's the, opposite, I suppose, of impedance, or the inverse of impedance, or the reciprocal of impedance. And the symbols, you don't need to know this for this exam question, right? But is Y, the letter Y is admittance. Admittance is not a very often used term, but we have it in our exam, right? So you just need to know for the exam, the admittance is the inverse or the reciprocal of impedance. That's the exam question right there, right? And just for your little extra information, Y is equal to 1 over Z. That's what reciprocal or inverse means, right? Z to the power, right, of minus 1 over Z, right? So this is what you need to know for the exam. Remember, we gave the tip. Anytime you see something in yellow, that usually indicates, not always, but it usually indicates it's an exam question. So we have a little bit more of a verbose explanation here of what admittance is. So just like impedance is pushback against the flow of the electrons, right? So admittance actually measures how easily it flows, right? So that's why admittance is sort of the opposite in a way, or the inverse of impedance, right? So bit of extra information here for hopefully to aid in our understanding. All right, now we come to another term, resonance. So persons who may be into music, you have a tuning fork, often talk about resonance. They have different things that we'll be talking about resonance. Somebody will say, well, you have a resonator for your car, or that idea resonates with me, right? So the term should be somewhat familiar to us, but in terms of electronics, electrical principles, resonance has a specific meaning, right? So let's look at some circuit diagrams here, some schematics, right? So on your left-hand side here, we have a circuit that shows an alternating current and two components, a capacitor and a coil or an inductor. And they are in series, right? So remember, series from the technician class is when we connect them back to back like that, right? Parallel, on the other hand, is when we connect them in this way. So series versus parallel. So similar circuit, except that these two components in this one is connected in series. So that's why we call it a series LC circuit. L because we have the coil or the inductor, and C because we have the capacitor. So it's a series LC circuit. On the right-hand side here, it's a parallel LC circuit because the capacitor and the inductor are in parallel. This is what we mean by connecting them in parallel. Notice, compare and contrast to series. So these are both LC circuits, right? Because it has an L and a C in it. If it had an R in it, it'll be an RLC circuit, right? So that's some of the terms that we use in electronics. So there's a frequency that when the capacitive reactance and the inductive reactance are equal, that frequency is called the resonant frequency, right? And for the exam, so we say that's when XC is equal to XL. When the reactance here is equal to the reactance here, you have the resonance, or you have resonant frequency operating. That's the condition under which it occurs. And for the exam, you need to learn that what occurs in an LC circuit, so again, these are LC circuits, at resonance is that the inductive reactance and the capacitive reactance cancel each other. In other words, they're equal and they cancel. So that's actually what causes things to flow easier or more easily. When that magic frequency, as I will call it, has arrived or is tuned, you have very good flow because the reactance of the capacitor and the reactance of the inductor, capacitive reactance and inductive reactance are equal. They cancel each other out, and therefore they allow for a nice smooth flow of the electrons in this circuit, and that's why it's resonant. Right? So resonance is a good thing. And also another exam question, similarly, what happens when inductive and capacitive reactance are equal? In a series LC circuit, again here we have a series LC circuit, is that resonance causes an impedance to be very low. So this is saying the same thing as before in just a different way, right? So when you have resonance occurring, impedance is very low. Right? So two exam questions that we must know. Now that's quite a bit of theory, but you may be asking yourself, well, why does that matter in amateur radio? We looked at some formulae, we looked at some concepts, some various terms. How does that help me operate my radio, my transceiver, my transmitter? Well, so important that we have a phrase, again, persons in the technician class would remember, we say hams are matchmakers. And that's not personal relationships we're talking about. We're talking about matching physical equipment to each other, because the equipment needs to be efficient. They need to match. If they're not matched, you generate heat, you can damage equipment. And of course, you're spinning top in mud, you're going nowhere, you're consuming a lot of power. And in this day and age where the price of electricity is only increasing, you want to make every single best use of that power that you are generating at your transmitter. So that's how those concepts that we just talked about become important, because resonance is important and matching is important. That's why we say hams are matchmakers. On your screen, we have a transmitter, transceiver as it were. We have a feed line that is connected to an antenna, and we want to make sure that it's properly matched. So all around town, we'll be talking about hams matching things, right? So this is just a slide for your information on why the concepts we just talked about are important to us. We need to learn them, we need to understand them, because when we adjust our equipment. Those are the concepts that we'll be utilizing in the back of our mind, the foundation, the theory that will allow us to operate our equipment properly, because we know about resistance, we know about capacitance, we know about inductance, we know about reactance, we know about admittance, we know about resonance, and that knowledge allows us to be able to use our equipment to match equipment together. So as we go on, those concepts will become clearer as to why they're important. All right. So final slide for the evening. We're not doing too badly in time. And, again, we talk about impedance in amateur radio. So we said that impedance matching is important in amateur radio. And there's several types of circuits when it comes to matching that you can use. And we need to know about as amateur radio operators. We either build them or we buy them already pre-built. But we need to get them to operate our radio equipment. And that's why we need to learn about these things. So the different types of circuits, what are those circuits doing? They are matching the output of a source, which is a transmitter or transceiver, to the input impedance of a load, which is an antenna. And that's this diagram here. You have your transmitter, your transceiver, you have a feed line, and then you have an antenna. And you need to match these two together. If they're not matched, that reflective wave wasted energy. And you may also detune your transmitter and cause it to overheat and damage it, right? So it's all about being safe. It's about being proper operating of your radio equipment. You want it to last long. You're going to spend some good money, and therefore you don't want to mash it up, as we say. You do not want to damage it. You want to take very good care. So the following devices are used for impedance matching at radio frequencies. So again, we're talking about the need to match transmitters or transceivers and antennas or the loads. So these are some of the circuits that we can use. We call them devices here, right? So the following devices can be used for impedance matching at radio frequencies. We're trying to match the load to the transmitter. The first one is a transformer. So those of you who did the technician class may recognize that this is a symbol for a transformer. And that's how you know this is a transformer circuit or device. You have the antenna here, it's grounded, and you have your transformer here. Those of you who recognize the symbol, it's a variable capacitor. But this here is the transformer. That's one device you can use to match impedances. It allows to have both sides operate together, different number of coils or turns, and therefore it matches one side to the other. So it's a transformer, helps in the matching. But it's not the only way. We have another one called a pi network. And we have up here, this is not TT, by the way, this is an attempt to put the symbol for the letter, Greek symbol, pi. And if you think about it here, this kind of looks like a pi. You have the top stroke here and you have the two down strokes, right? With the components, you have the coil and you have the capacitors. So this looks like a pi, and that's why it's called a pi network, right? So this is another circuit or device type that allows you to match two sides. So one side will be a transmitter or transceiver, and the other side you have your antenna or its load. And you tinker or tweak these variable capacitors here. Sometimes it's a variable inductor as well, and then you match one side to the other. So remember impedance matching, a transformer can do it, a pi network can do it. And the last one for your exam that you need to know, again, yellow means exam question. This is an exam question here, folks. And the exam question will be all of the above, because all of the answers are right. So that's actually the answer, all of the above, right? And the last one will be a length of transmission line. Yes, believe it or not, piece of coax, length of transmission line can be used to match between, right? So here is an attempt for them, it shows a stubby piece, they cut a little piece of the transmission line. That's a coaxial cable piece there. So you have the source and then you have the load on one side, and you can use a transmission line to match or to do impedance matching. So we need to learn that these three things can be used for impedance matching at RF or radio frequencies: a transformer, pi network, length of transmission line, and we have provided some pictures as to what they look like so that these things are not hopefully too abstract concepts. All right, so we said that was the last slide. So quickly, we'll just go through the question pool questions and we will end our session after that. So give me a moment to just quickly share the slide, switch across from our slide deck to our trusty question pool. All right, so I did say I'll be using the No Nonsense Guide as the basis for the sessions. Again, if you have a copy of it, that's fine. If you don't, that's also okay. You can follow along with me, but we do encourage you to get a copy, either the PDF version from the website. I think it's all of $10 US, or you can get the hard copy off from Amazon, right? So here we go. So unfortunately, we are not able to distribute this document, right? We did in the technician class have the author's permission so to do. It's free of charge. So if you want your copy, feel free to purchase. But we'll use the text. Right. So let's go straight to the question pool. We did all of these just now. So let's go quickly. First question. What is reactance? So the correct answer is reactance is the opposition to the flow of alternating current caused by capacitance or inductance. Right? That's what reactance is. Remember the symbol X. Next question in the question pool. So we just did that theory, folks, right? So it should be fresh on our minds, hopefully, and we're making the connection. But feel free, it's new concept, so we need to go it over. You can have a look at it again or read further. Which of the following is opposition to the flow of alternating current in an inductor? Well, it's the same thing. It's reactance. Same question that they're posing to you differently. Right? So reactance, that's the opposition to the flow. Alternating current is the key, right? So if we were to dissect this question, it's alternating current, not direct current. And it's an inductor, right? And the question has been asked, what opposes the flow in such a situation? Alternating current with an inductor. Well, it's called reactance, not resistance, right? Reactance. Okay. Next question in question pool. Which of the following is opposition to the flow of alternating current in a capacitor? Well, they've just asked us the same question. Instead of an inductor, it's a capacitor, but it's still reactance, right? Okay. In one case, one will increase with the increasing frequency, and one will decrease with the increasing frequency, as you remember, right? So both questions, the answer is reactance, opposition to the flow of alternating current. But in this case, a capacitor, it's reactance. If it were an inductor, it's also reactance. Right. What's the letter we used to represent reactance? We said it was the letter X. And what's the unit that we use to measure reactance? It's the same for resistance. It's the ohm, right? So reactance measured in the ohm. Symbol is the omega. All right, next question in the question pool. How does an inductor react to AC? So that's why we looked at the inductive reactance formula to see if we change frequency, what happens to the reactance. Right? That's why we did a little exercise. But this is the conclusion. As the frequency of the applied AC increase, and AC again is alternating current, not air conditioning. As the frequency of the applied alternating current increases, the reactance does what? Does it decrease? No, it increases. How do we know that? Because of the formula that we used, 2 pi FL, right? XL is equal to that, right? So let's deal now with a similar question, but in this case here, capacitor. How does a capacitor react to alternating current? Let's dissect it. What they're really asking you here, because of the answers that they give, as the frequency changes, what happens? Right? In this case, they're asking about an increase. When you increase the frequency of the source, what happens? The reactance will decrease if you have a capacitor. Right? Again, we use the formula 1 over 2 pi FC to show that as the frequency increases, the reactance will decrease. That's why we did a little example. All right. Couple more questions. What is impedance? We said it was the ratio of voltage to current. So again, remember that ratio of voltage to current. If you look back at the slide, if you're not sure. Right? So things for us to learn. And what is the term for the inverse of impedance? Let's break that down. They're asking us what's kind of the opposite or the reciprocal, the inverse of impedance. Well, we learned that to be the very oddball, unusual term you don't hear too often. It's called admittance. Couple more questions. What occurs in an LC circuit at resonance? So let's dissect this question. They're asking us about an LC circuit. But what is an LC circuit? Well, we showed a schematic diagram with a circuit that has a source, an alternating current source. It had a coil or an inductor, and it had a capacitor. And we said that L is inductor and C is capacitor. So an LC circuit is simply a circuit that has a coil or an inductor as well as a capacitor in it. But what happens to such a circuit at resonance? We said when that happens at resonance, both the inductive reactance and the capacitive reactance, they're equal and they cancel each other out. That's what happens at resonance. Next question in the question pool. What happens when inductive and capacitive reactance are equal in a series LC circuit? Let's dissect this question a little bit. So again, all of these questions asking something similar from a different perspective. Let's dissect. What happens when an inductive and capacitive reactance? So that's what they're talking about. Inductive and capacitive reactance. So we should already know what we're talking about. We're talking about resonance. We're talking about they're canceling each other, and we're talking about a smooth flow, right? Once we're talking about that, and they are equal, and they're just giving us that it's an LC circuit. Again, similar to before, LC circuit, what is that? A circuit with a source, alternating current source, and it only has an inductor and a capacitor. What happens when the inductive and capacitive reactance are equal? We get a low impedance. So it causes resonance, causes impedance to be very low. So when inductive and capacitive reactance are equal, that's resonant. We have a resonant frequency, resonance. And therefore, when it's resonant, there's smooth flow in that circuit. So the impedance is very low. All right, so last question for the evening, and we'll bring it to a wrap. All right, so which of the following devices can be used for impedance matching at radio frequencies? So we said that a transformer can be used to match. Remember, hams are matchmakers. We can use a transformer. We can use a pi circuit or a pi network. Right? Remember, we saw the capacitors, variable capacitors on the inductor in a sort of pi formation. And we can also use a piece of coax, which is a length of transmission line. So the correct answer is all of the above, or all these choices are correct. So let's just return to our slideshow. All right. So let's see here now. We just had a review of the question pool, right? So hopefully those questions would help us in understanding what we are trying to understand in the theory that we did, right? So it's important to have the grounding, and that's why if persons have not yet done the technician class, we encourage you have all of this week here to consider looking at some or more of those sessions. That will allow us to move on a little faster, and it will allow some of the material to be a lot clearer with that background, because we spend quite a lot of detailed time in the technician class going through. We will not be able to go through as slowly as we can when we recap some of the material, but we recap it hopefully for connections to be made. But the key here is to learn for the exam, right? So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send an email. It's in yellow here, robbie@9y4r.com. You can also send me a WhatsApp message at this number, 682-2212. Our next session is next week, Friday, the 3rd of November. Now, I'll be traveling, and I'm hoping that where I will be, the internet service will be sufficient to allow proper streaming, right? So I expect it will work, but again, just letting everyone know in advance, in case we have any difficulty, we will look to reschedule at that point, right? So we will not cancel next week's session. We will look to schedule it and have it with the understanding that if we do encounter difficulty, I do apologize in front if it happens, we will just need to reschedule. But class will be on, as usual, next Friday, God's willing. That's Friday, the 3rd of November, I believe it is, at 8:30 p.m. So, folks, I know it was quite a bit to absorb this evening. It may be a bit challenging to make the connections, but look over the material, especially technician class information, where we go quite a bit into detail. Look over this evening session, go through the little formula again. We didn't break it out. Normally we'll show you every single step in the calculation, but we're hoping that you can look at the formula and get that analogy, that reference point to show when something on one side increases, whether it will increase or decrease on the other side, right? But the idea is to learn and understand those relationships, right? Resonance and reactance. So yes, it may be a bit challenging. However, please spend some time with it, and we will encounter those things further on as well. So folks, that's about it for this evening. Thank you very much, and we do look forward to seeing you in next week's session, same time. So be safe, everyone. Do have a good night.